Studies Research, I have to always look at that. Was Executive Director of the organization for 10 years and now serves as Associate Director and is Principal Investigator. And we are very, very proud to have him as a member of our board.
Okay, let's test this out. Does this sound okay toward the back?
That sounds
Very
pretty
good,
good.
doesn't rattle too much? Good deal, good deal.
You can hear.
And, well, it's a pleasure to be on the board of Geronimo Springs Museum. This is my second stint. I was on the board between about 1990 and 2000, something like that. And so I'm here again. And the museum, as you know, is a wonderful place with the whole history of Sierra County collected in it. Archives, photos, things you don't see behind the scenes. It's really something that Sierra County needs to be proud of. It struggles financially. We fight all the time to get through each month. And so we just had a garage sale, and apparently it was pretty successful. Doesn't take a lot to run this place, but we need a little extra. The city here a few years ago was always giving us a pretty good shot at lodger's tax. And given the problems with, with money and lodger's tax and more people wanting it, well, that has diminished, so we're having to figure out ways to replace that. And so this lecture is one way of doing it in the lecture series. But anyway, if you happen to have something you don't mind getting rid of that you think might be a good garage sale item, bring it by the museum, because it will help the museum, and they're going to be doing a bit more of that. And I haven't talked to the board about this one, but if you have an old car that you're ready to trade in and not worth too much, or you want to donate it to the museum, I bet you we could figure out a deal with a used car dealer and help sell it, and it would all go to the museum. These donations are all to a 501c3, and they're tax deductible. We also have a donors club that's available. We've got about 10 or 12 members to that at this point. If you're interested in joining the donors club, well, come see me or come see Marilyn. So enough of the commercials. I know you hear enough about that. But the reason we're able to have this museum and have this lecture here today, the reason we're able to have the lecture here today is because we have the museum. And so we'd like to be able to keep doing that, and we want to build it and have it here for a long, long time. It's been here 40 years already, which is a pretty good record. So today I'm going to talk about Cañada Alamosa, where I spent 13 years from 1999 to 2011 doing field work at the Monticello Box Ranch, which was at that time owned by Dennis and Trudy O'Toole. I work for Human Systems Research. We're a nonprofit. Denny and Trudy established a nonprofit, the Cañada Alamosa Institute, and we formed a partnership. And that resulted in, I think Denny, when we got there, he was from back east. He'd been raised in Iowa. He'd spent time in Arizona as a kid. He was a historian. He worked at Colonial Williamsburg. And he came out here and walked across the sites and saw all the pottery on the ground and saw the beautiful rugged canyon there. And he wanted to be part of developing that history. And I think he kind of envisioned, well, we'll do a little archaeology, we'll have a little report, we'll have a lot of fun. And we did all those things, except this project grew like topsy. And we learned a lot about the Cañada Alamosa. And I filled a semi-trailer full of samples and flakes and this and that and the other, which were slowly getting processed. They'll ultimately be at the University of New Mexico at the Maxwell Museum at the Frank Hidden Archaeological Center. Denny and Trudy very generously, the shelves are already there. They're waiting for the stuff. So generations of graduate students beyond my time will be able to go back through the stuff and say, well, Carl said this and that was wrong. And that's great, because
Yes, it is.
because that's what this is all about. It's a learning experience. And it was a learning experience for me, not just because of what we learned about the archaeology and culture and the cultures that have inhabited the canyon, but I interacted with all kinds of wonderful scientists from other walks of life, sometimes archaeology really isn't considered a science, you know, we're kind of an art, or we do voodoo or something, we talk about culture, and you can't quantify it really well, you know, scientists like to measure things. We had some real rocket scientists came out to our project. They were measuring the difference in our dirt levels in increments of millimeters, and we're saying, you know, you really don't need to do that. But these fine people, we had Ginger McLemore, a geologist from Tech, Curtis Monger, a soil scientist from New Mexico State University, Rick Holloway, he's a paleobotanist from Northern Arizona University, David Kane and Michael Wild, both graduate students at their respective universities, looked at the faunal remains. To give you an idea, we had 25,000 individual pieces of bone, animal bone, that came out that spanned 700 years of occupation. So we were able to talk about changes in species and what the people were doing and using, and we'll talk about a little about that today. We had a couple of graduate students that worked for Phil Shelley, got their masters at Eastern New Mexico University. Josh and Antonio both got their master's theses were done on work at Cañada Alamosa. So all these people brought to me ways of looking at the data that I didn't know how to do, but I knew that they could help. And so we have a wonderful record, at least a heck of a beginning, for environmental change in the Cañada Alamosa and how humans interacted with it. Now, going back to archaeology not being a science, and people frequently say, well, really, what's that good for? You're talking about potsherds, you're talking about people. So what if this Pueblo group changed pottery styles and merged with that Pueblo group? It's all kind of the same thing, right? Well, maybe so. We'll just give them that. But what archaeology does, and keep this in your mind, it provides us with the longest available record of human interaction with a very changeable environment. We just have the history part of it. We just have the last few hundred years. Archaeology gives us, in this case, several thousand years of change and what people were doing to the extent that we can figure it out from the archaeology about that change. So, most of you know where the Alamosa is, just north of us and coming into Rio Grande. And there's a Google shot, plains of San Augustine, the San Mateos, the Wahoos, the northern end of the Black Range, the upper Alamosa drainage to the box, and then you comes down the box, you can see all the green, you can see the water goes exactly that far. That green means that something's growing. And so that's our study area. When we did this project, we had the 4 sites that we were interested in. We had the O'Toole property, but that's really just sort of the center of it all. Our study area was a full 725 square miles of the watershed. And as you get farther down into the watershed, and as the springs come into the canyon, they come down and give us another little better view here. And you can see there's kind of a bigger area here that things really develop. And that's the central area where we did most of our work. The other thing that I want to mention to you is that, see how eroded these soils are here and here? All there are long, narrow ridges, and they've been cut. And the soil that was originally on top of them, which looked like that originally, has all been washed down into the Alamosa. But for some reason, this area between Kelly and San Mateo Canyon hasn't been eroded that way, probably because this sort of bottlenecked it and the drainage didn't hit it. So Curtis Monger says that these soils, which are soils that emanated from, and I'll talk about that in a minute, from Vic's Peak when it blew way back when, these soils right in here on that nice flat surface are some of the oldest soils in New Mexico, going back millions of years. And then, of course, the crown jewel of the Cañada Alamosa is the Ojo Caliente, that wonderful spring that comes up, we think, from about 1,500 feet below the surface. And it hits the box, and the uplift at the box brings those waters, forces it to the surface. And because it's that box, those uplifts are right on the edge of the Rio Grande Rift, there's some action down there. There's some movement, and so things are warm down there. And that's why that warm water, that's why that deep water comes up warm, because of that geological phenomenon. And the water pours out down the canyon at about 2,000 gallons a minute, which is in New Mexico an amazing place. As the geologist said, usually water comes out of a canyon. In this case, water goes into a canyon. And it comes down into La Cienega. This is the center, the O'Toole house is there on the left. And the canyon widens, and it allows people to do agriculture. You actually have some terraces where you can do some farming. And the Cienega itself, which is located down here by the foot of the Victorio site, in which you can see right there, is probably the remnant of an old riparian area that was much bigger 20,000 years ago, with a lot more water involved. And what's interesting about the Cienega is that the geologist believes, and I agree with her, is that the water that makes the Cienega a wet place, a swampy place, is not water coming down the canyon. It's water coming out of the San Mateos underneath that happens to come up right there. So that's an entirely different water source. Now, if you ask the Monticello ditch water users if you could use that water for something else, they probably wouldn't agree with that interpretation. But I think that's what's going on. It's coming up, and I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about a spring that came from that direction, but that particular spring dried up about 6,000 years ago. So we've got these five sites that we look at. This being the Cienega down here. The biggest site is the Victorio site, which has both pit houses and surface rooms. Kelly Canyon is a smaller, just a Pueblo site. Pinnacle Ruin is a site built on an uplift that's probably our last Pueblo occupation. The Montoya site has both really early material and stuff that dates to the 1100s and the Mimbres. And then Montoya Butte has been many things: a shrine, a pit house village, a place of refuge. And so those are the five sites that we were privileged to work on over those 13 years. But let's go way back before any of these people were there. We have a long history of climate change. And of course, climate change right now gets you in a fight. Curtis Munger, the soil scientist, said it used to be fun to talk about climate change. He's been studying climate change in southern New Mexico for 25 years and looking at the variation in wet and dry cycles that we've had. But we've had 4 major glaciations, and so the last interglacial, this is a temperature change. This is based on material coming out of ice in Antarctica, so it's real general. But the last time that there wasn't much of a glacier and the temperatures got this high was about 125,000 years ago. Then we went back into a glacial period, and it sort of waxed and waned, and we had all these glaciers, and it stayed cold, and it got real cold until about 20,000 years ago it was at its coldest. And then, since then, it's been getting warmer for the last 10,000 years. 15,000 years, really. So, before all that happened, 28 million years ago, Vic's Peak was an active volcano. What we see now is what's left of the caldera. And Ginger McLemore, the geologist from Tech, did an entire geologic survey of the Montoya Butte Quadrangle, and she wrote up a paper that's on file and it's available at Tech on the geology of that. And so 28 million years ago, Vic's Peak, and it was a lot bigger then, because this is just what's left, blew. And to give you an idea how much it blew there's stuff from Vic's Peak in Arizona. It was a big volcano. And when it blew, after it blew, what was left started to erode. Okay, so this is the canyon, Cañada Alamosa. This is where the O'Toole House is, this is the Cienega, this is the Victoria site. And so sometime after 28 million years ago, after the big blow, this uplift was already in place. This is a rhyolite uplift. This is the west side of the canyon. And so all that material that was left over from the volcano started to erode with, many millions of years of rain and water. And it filled all this. There used to be a canyon there, but now it filled all that with material until it was up here at this level, and there really wasn't any Cañada Alamosa. But by 200,000 years ago, that water, that persistent water from the plains of San Augustine, which was a lake at that time, and the water that came through started to cut through that canyon. And so the old Alamosa 200,000 years ago was way above the terraces and the canyon bottom that we look at now. And it continued to erode. So 100,000 years ago, it was down a little lower. And it left terraces. Each time it went a little lower. Curtis Munger talks about the bathtub rings. When water gets high and then it gets a little lower and it's a little lower, depending on how dirty you are, of course. But these terraces are the bathtub rings of various episodes of erosion that cut through the Cañada Alamosa. So the Victoria site is on one of the more recent ones. So at the glacial maxima, 20,000 years ago, we were at its coldest, and then it started to warm up. And at that point in time, the geologists are pretty sure that there was a localized glacier on top of the San Mateos. So Vic's Peak, Mount Withington, both of those probably had glaciers. Maybe they went down into the gap in between. But when it started to warm up, that localized glacier started to melt, and they're probably on Magdalena Peak as well. And so you ended up with a lake where we now have the plains of San Augustine. And so this glacier melted and melted and melted. Now to give you some perspective, there was one in the Sacramento Mountains over on the other side of the state as well. And the Tularosa Basin had huge lakes in it. And so for 20,000 years, until about 8,000 years ago, those glaciers existed. And they gave us all this wonderful water, not only water on the surface, but groundwater. Okay, now with our current population, we're using that old water up. And there are no more glaciers until we have another ice age, which I don't know if we want to wait around for. So with the end of the glacial period, about 10,000 years ago, things start drying up in earnest. And about 8,000 years ago, we hit this thing we call the altathermal. And the altathermal is basically a long damn drought. And it lasted from 8,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago, more or less. So 3,000 years of really, really dry and reasonably warm period of time. Now, it was pretty interesting because on the Victoria site, which is located on that terrace, and had all those Pueblo rooms on it, down below one of the Pueblo rooms, when Ginger was doing the map, she found this bed of material in the side arroyo. There's a big arroyo that cuts through the Victoria site. And on that side arroyo, she said, well, this is faircrete. And I went, crazy damn geologists are giving me another word I don't understand. What is faircrete? Well, ferrite comes from ferrous, it comes from iron. And so what happens when you have underground water, and in this case it's absorbing iron oxides and manganese into a solution. And it's underground, so there's no air to mess with it. And when it comes bubbling out in the spring, then all of a sudden it hits the air, and that iron and manganese solidify. And you end up with this solid looking stuff. The black is the manganese, the red is the iron oxide. And so Curtis Munger and Ginger and I were sitting there staring at it one day, and we were wondering, okay, this was a spring here. This is a spring here a long time ago. You know, was it 20,000 years ago? Was it 100,000 years ago? And was it here when the people were living here? Is this part of the reason they were here? And Curtis says, well, you know, as that stuff solidified in that spring, it probably captured carbon from the plants that were growing in the spring. And I went, well, could we radiocarbon date that? And so we chopped off a sample, and he did his, he's got a gadget down there at NMSU that breaks it all up and makes it and separates the carbon out, and or at least was able to measure the carbon. And so I sent this little batch of carbon to the radiocarbon lab, and it came back to me. He said, nope, not enough carbon. Curtis, you got more? Yep, got more. Ground it up. And I didn't know I was spending $600 on this. It was very hard-earned money to figure this out, and I didn't know it was even going to date. Radiocarbon dates only go back within the accuracy to 40,000 years ago or so. So this could have been 200,000 years ago. And when the date came back, it not only gave us a date, but it gave us a pretty tight date within 100 years of about, and the date when we calibrate it comes out to about 7,000 years ago. And so what I think this is, this little remnant, those glaciers melted, all that water was up in that mountain and underground, and it was coming out in little seeps and springs up high on terraces where we don't see springs anymore. And then during the ultrathermal, when things got really, really dry, the last drip of water came out of the spring about 7,000 years ago. Now the people there, the Pueblos weren't there yet, but still, ain't that cool? I got real excited about it. Doesn't take much to excite us, by the way. So there we are. The ultrathermal, long and dry, and then at the end of the ultrathermal, when things start cooling off and we start getting more rainfall, and we don't have any precipitation data for here because we don't have any tree rings that go that far back. But 4,000 years ago it started to cool off, and there's other kinds of evidence that say things got wetter. And in the meantime, people are hunting rabbits, they're being hunter-gatherers, they're moving around in big seasonal rounds, they're not staying in one place. They're using these big corner-notched projectile points in what we call these late archaic in style. And basically they're hunters and gatherers, and just they can do wherever, and if it doesn't work here, well, they move. Not too much different from what we do now, except the economy is a little different. And so on the Montoya site, this is the O'Toole house, we worked there for a while, and we had a member site there, but there was a slope. It was unusual because this terrace had a slope coming off that western canyon wall. And so that kind of gives you an idea. We're looking downslope toward the O'Toole house. And in 2011, we decided, our last year there, we decided we wanted to go deep into that slope to see what was underneath. And so this is a map of the site. And there were the Pueblo rooms here, there, and yon. But we wanted to get into this stuff. And so we sort of played tic-tac-toe with it with some test bits. And right here, feature 15, we went down 1.5 meters, Johnny Shue sitting at the back of the room was on this, with this deal, with Denny O'Toole. And it was pick and shovel work, kids. This is not trowels and brushes. This is a digging bar. It was hard. And right up at the top in that dark area, we had some potsherds and stuff, and then the potsherds went away. And it was just light dirt. We got all the way to the bottom, and we hit the top, the old Alamosa terrace, onto which the material from the canyon wall had slumped. And at that very bottom, at 1.5 meters, there was all this, what we call calcrete. It's calcium carbonate. When plants grow for a long time in an area, they leach out this calcium carbonate, and if there's nothing to stop it, it keeps going and going. And the top of that terrace stopped it. It was a gravel terrace, and it was like dust down there. It was almost like ash, and it was thick. It was unusually thick. It had been waiting a long time.
And so that's our profile. Going all the way down, there's some stuff here. And then right at the very bottom, sharp-eyed Johnny Shue found 2 itty-bitty pieces of corn. And I thought, well, that's interesting. We'll just put them in a bag, and the rats probably brought them down from up top where the Pueblo people were. And so I forgot about them, didn't forget about them, but I didn't do anything with them for about a year. I didn't get real excited about it. They were little tiny pieces of corn. And so about a year later, I sent them off, and they came back at 3,900 to 4,000 years old. Were some of the earliest corn in the Southwest. Now there's only a few sites. Now what we know about corn is it was developed in Mexico, and then it was hybridized and came out of a grass, was teosinte, and they still fight about exactly how that happened. But by 4,000 years ago, you had a type called chapalote. It was kind of a popcorn, and this is the first corn that came into the Southwest about 4,000 years ago. And right now we've got some scientists out there who are doing DNA on old corn and trying to establish how many strains there were and all that. They're having a lot of fun. And then of course, 4,000 years ago, corn had its ups and downs, but it stayed around. And so by 1,400 years ago, you get much larger kernels and a much more viable product from your corn. Anyway, finding old corn is a big deal, and we found some. That's the early maize sites in the Southwest from Linda Cordell's last overview on American Southwestern archaeology. And you can see we fit very nicely in some of the earliest stuff around. And that's where the different early corn comes from. So Bat Cave had some of the earliest. The thing about Cañada Alamosa and this site called Old Corn up at Zuni is those are the only 2 sites that aren't rock shelters where it's protected. These are open sites where early corn has been found. But what Curtis is saying is that the material that slumped off this canyon wall probably slumped off about the time the old corn was there. And his rationale is that during the altithermal, all of this canyon wall on the west side, it had all vestiges of that material from the washout of Big Speak, and so it had soil up here and it had vegetation. And during that long dry altithermal, that vegetation got really, really dry, and it died. And then the big rains came 4,000 years ago, and it washed off the slope. And all that, without any vegetation to stabilize it, this all slumped off. And so what we were digging through at the Montoya site was basically what he calls a colluvial slump and a colluvial wedge, and that had come off about 4,000 years ago. So big changes in the Cañada Alamosa about 4,000 years ago. And so there's the arrival with the temperature. And you can see the temperature keeps going down. It becomes much more viable. It's not as hot for any time over the next 4,000 years. But this little period of time between 4,000 years ago and the present has been opened up to us by another area just below the Victoria site. This is a 1935 aerial photo, and I want you to look at this terrace, this slope, the river's going by, the ditch is coming over here, and that terrace is pretty much complete. And there it is today. And you can see that big chunk of it is gone. It's been washed out by the Alamosa since 1935. And so that much has disappeared in the last few years. And I was wondering, is anybody else warm in here? Would it be good to put on a little bit of air and I'll talk louder? Then once you've fallen asleep, the good part's still to come. Okay. See what the swamp cooler does to us. So this is the edge of that terrace that got cut by the Alamosa. And when Curtis saw this, he got really, really, really excited. Our people get excited about different things, and soil scientists get excited about big arroyos that cut open chunks of landscape and show you what's going on. And he got really excited by this really dark lens right in here that's very organic. So we went out and we did got some picked out charcoal, and we found one right in here that was 3,200 years ago. BP is before present, which really doesn't mean present, it means before 1950. And 1950 is sort of the date they decided on. And then that dark organic layer, which indicates a fairly stable period, was there about 2,500 years ago. And then right up here at the top is another dark organic, not as well defined, that was about 1,900 years ago. And so we went back several times when we had that opportunity. And the last time we found a hearth way down deeper than any time we had seen anything we'd seen before. And we got the initial radiocarbon date is 3,400, but when you calibrate that, the actual date is about 3,700. And what was interesting is we had Randy Furr in his backhoe trench up there, trencher, and right underneath this are old Rio Alamosa stream gravels. So the Alamosa flowed there before the terrace started developing 4,000 years ago. And then with the wash off from the side developing the terrace, it covered the old Alamosa stream bed. And for 4,000 years, it developed into this nice terrace, and then since 1935, that terrace has been cut back again. So this is a repeated cycle of filling and cutting that is very typical of the Cañada Alamosa. So the story we have now is that 4,000 years ago, this terrace development started, just like the terrace development, the slump over on the Montoya site. And there wasn't anything to hold it. This indicates that things were pretty dry. Everything just kept washing off. It kept steadily developing until about 3,000 years ago. And about 3,000 years ago, that surface stabilized like the surface we have today. And it stayed stable with grass on it for 500 years. A long period of time when everything was just sort of mellow, it was hanging together. Now the other thing of interest is in that lens, we haven't dated it yet, but sometime between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago, there was somebody living on that surface who was using corn, because we have corn in that layer. And then, 2,500 years ago, something happened and the vegetation went away up above, it got dry again, and it started eroding, and it filled up for another 600 years, and then about 2,000 years ago, it stabilized again for a very short period of time, and then things broke loose again, and it started filling and developing until it stabilized at its current period, which was probably maybe a couple hundred years ago. So, we haven't explored all this yet, but that's a lot of change, kids. Think about what we're going through right now. Think about our dry, we fuss about the 1950s drought and the 8-year drought. We're talking hundreds of years of significant change, and then hundreds of years of pretty stable situations. So the other thing that Curtis does that I learned about were carbon isotopes. And carbon isotopes are left in the soil by the plants that grow there. And if they take the carbon isotopes, and again, he's got a gizmo that separates it all out, and he's able to measure them. And he did this twice here to make sure his data was right. But carbon isotopes can be separated into C3 versus C4 plants. So shrubs versus grasses. And so at 3,200 years ago, it was pretty shrubby. And then slowly over time, it got grassier and grassier and grassier. And then it hit that stable period. And for quite a while, it was a nice stable grassland. And then the erosion started again, and this thing went back to shrubs. And it was pretty shrubby. Then it started slowly going back to more and more grasses above. And it stabilized. And stable for a little while, and then back to shrubs, and now back to grasses. So all that's happened in the last 4,000 years. And then again, the underlying stream gravels were a version of the Cañada of the Rio Alamosa that operated sometime probably during the Ultathermal. So a reconstructed temperature now. If we get past that point of 2,000 years ago, we really don't have much to look at in terms of the soils. We've only got this last little bit, maybe a meter, maybe 3 feet of soils in the last 2,000 years, because things have been fairly stable, fairly grassy in general, even though we've had big droughts. But as we get into, from 2,000 years ago this way, we can use the temperature reconstructions. And like I see, these are pretty gross, but we have an opportunity to get some more. There's a lady in Albuquerque that's going to be working on this next spring. And so the temperature's getting cooler, but the evidence that we have is that it's very, very dry. And this is the early pit house period. And here we can start introducing data from tree rings. And so tree rings, these are from the San Mateos and from the Magdalenas. And about 300 AD, 1,700 years ago, we went into a drought. This is precipitation. High, low, 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 low. Look at that, 200 years. 200 years of below average rainfall, and for comparison, that's the drought we had in the 1950s. So imagine living in this country for 200 years in that kind of a drought. And that's when these first early pit house folks were up on top of Montoya Butte, hanging out. There weren't a lot of them. They were growing a little corn, but everybody was being pretty defensive and trying to get into places, because again, when times are stressed, everybody wants what everybody else has. And so there were defensive walls. Kettle Top out here at Elephant Butte is another site like that. It's an F site, a fortified site, and it dates to that early period when they were just making brown and red pottery. So if we go back to the next period, we end up in what is referred to as the beginning of the medieval warm period. And this started out talking about it in Europe. It was a time when they were doing grapes. They were doing all kinds of things in Britain they can't do now because things had gotten warmer and the world had changed on them. And that's when we see the later pit houses to the early Pueblos really going strong. And you can see what happens that after this nasty drought, all of a sudden it spikes, okay, between 6 and 700, 6 and 800 really, you get a lot of rainfall. And then you get ups and downs, but it never gets that bad again, and it goes along nicely until you hit the 1100s when you get a nice spike. And so the medieval warm period, flashback, this canyon is continuing to cut, and so we're still not down at this point when people were living there. We're not down to the valley floor we're looking at today. As Curtis says, I forget how many years, but in X number of years, 50,000 years, maybe 10,000 years from now, when we stood on the valley bottom that was today, we'd be looking down into a canyon because it's going to continue to cut. And the pit houses were, from that period, they started growing a lot of corn. They had real villages. They were dug into those rocky terraces. This is one up on the Victoria site. This is just a portion of one because we so much dirt we couldn't dig it all. And it's about just a piece of the pie. And we have people from both the south and the north contributing pottery. We've got Mogollon pottery, the Mogollon red on brown, and then we have the San Marcial black on white from the north. So the beauty about Cañada Alamosa, and I talked about this when I gave the Frontier lecture last spring, is that we're on the edge of big cultural areas that do things differently in terms of the pottery and the architecture. And Cañada Alamosa is kind of the melting pot for that situation. And then when you get into the Pueblo period, and this is the period where that big spike in rainfall came in the between 1000 and 1100. And we get all these little member sites with member ceramics on them. This is the Cuchillo Negro. This is the area in between the Cuchillos and the town of Cuchillo, and the HOK ranch and stuff are in there. And then this is the Cañada Alamosa. And all these sites have some members pottery on them. They're not real permanent sites. They're not like the ones in the Members Valley. And they don't have lots of pots in them. They have this pottery was being traded out, and they used it down to the nubbins. This is what you find on the site in the Members Valley. This is what we found at the Montoya site. Just as interesting to us, but not nearly as pretty. And probably during that really wet period, you've got people coming out of the Members Valley and other areas into places like the Alamosa and the Cuchillo Negro and that HOK area, and they're doing a little bit of agriculture on very marginal soils, but because they have that rainfall, they can get away with it. So for 100 years, they're doing it. And then, of course, it dries out. Between 1100 and 1150, it gets nasty again. And so people draw back to where there's water. Well, there's always water in the bottom of the Cañada Alamosa. But to survive in the Cañada Alamosa, you need to have a healthy upland environment as well. You can't just survive on the valley bottom. You've got to have both. So the people who were at the Cañada Alamosa, because there was some water there, because of that spring and its regular 2,000 gallons a minute, they stayed, but they were joined by a group from the Rio Salado. This is our interpretation, which is up north of Magdalena. And the Rio Salado is very dry. When it rains way up here, it goes all the way to the Rio Grande really quick. And so you can walk across it, and it's dry in the morning, and you try to get back across it at night, and you can't cross it. But none of the water stays there. So if there's no rainfall, it doesn't do you any good as an agriculturalist. You have to have the steady rainfall. And when that drought came along, some of these people moved down to the Cañada Alamosa, where they probably already had social connections. They're already intermarried, they're trading corn, so they knew some people down there. And when they came down, they brought their own style of architecture and site plan with a kiva out in front of it, the linear Anasazi Northern Pueblo plan. And so we have migrants. We have people living side by side with the Mimbres-related folks in the Cañada. And they all kind of hung together for a while. This is coral black on white. This is what they were making as opposed to the Mimbres pottery. And this is one of the rooms at the Kelly Canyon site. We didn't find this pot. We found one broken that was like it. But by and large, this site had more ceramics on it than anything else we had, any of the other sites. And they were bringing all those down with them from the Rio Salado. We don't think they're making them there. And so we get two groups there. And then about AD 1200, you see the drought, and then it gets nice again in the early 1200s. Have a pretty good series. It doesn't, at least average rainfall and then above average rainfall. And so probably more and more people aggregate to the Cañada Alamosa. Folks from the north, folks to the south, and they proceed to build themselves. They all, instead of being a whole bunch of little pueblos up and down the drainage, they all gather on what we call the Victorio site, which at last count was somewhere over 450 to 500 rooms. We can't see them all from the surface. And right in here is where that Fair Creek business was. And so all of these people have banded together. And when I say all of these people, I mean a 500-room site, it sounds like lots of folks. But probably only a couple of hundred were occupied at the same time. And so you might have 150 people, 200 people, maybe 300 people in the canyon at that point. You can only keep so many people going, but compared to the sites around it, this is a big site. And so everybody aggregated. They were very much connected with the social system. It works good. And so those little bags drying there are ash caught in, I want to call it, when you plum dresses out of it. Something like that. Anyway, when I go to the fabric store and I tell them I want several yards of this stuff, they look at me funny. But anyway, we cut it up, we make little bags, we send it off to the botanist, and they identify the plant species of that charcoal. Well, that's living north. So one of the big things that you hear all the time, and there's been some respected plant scientists from NMSU who have tried to say that, yep, we didn't have much mesquite. It was only in the bottomlands of New Mexico before the cattle came in, and then the cattle ate the seeds and they spread it everywhere. Well, I agree there was some of that, but we have mesquite charcoal in pack rat middens coming up out of northern Mexico 4,000 years ago when it gets introduced. And basically it follows the course of the Chihuahuan Desert, which is slowly spreading north, north, north. And so by 2,000 years ago, when we dig hars out in the middle of the Tularosa Basin or other places out on the Lordsburg Mesa, there's a lot of mesquite out there. There's a bunch of mesquite, and cows weren't here then. The mesquite already spread. And so the same is true with Cañada Alamosa. We have mesquite in our charcoal from as early charcoal as we have, about AD 600, all the way through to 1400. And as Curtis says, the mesquite is kind of a high water mark of the Chihuahuan Desert encroaching, and then water conditions coming in and maybe pushing it back, and then it gets a little drier again, and it makes it a little farther. So we have mesquite at 6,000 feet, 600 years ago. No cows.
When was the creosote introduced?
About the same time. It's part of that Chihuahuan Desert mix.
Now that ultimately rains.
Yeah, it ultimately did.
Half reach spread.
Yeah.
More so than the mesquite. Mesquite was used for food and fuel.
Right. Yeah, but yeah, that's all part of that same Chihuahuan Desert moving north.
So it's part of the general climatic change that happened from 4,000 years ago this way in terms of the encroachment of the Chihuahuan Desert. Now the other thing, which is interesting, is Phragmites. And Phragmites is not currently present in the upper Rio Alamosa. But we have it, just like the mesquite, all the way through from 600 to 1400. Now for those of you not familiar with it, you probably have it down here along the river, because we have it along the ditches in Las Cruces. It looks like a bamboo or a cane, and it's a rhizome, so it's got a fairly shallow but very sturdy root system. And I broke a lot of shovel handles trying to get it out of my yard in Las Cruces. You know, it's hard to get out. But what's interesting is we don't have any there now, and yet we had it throughout the entire sequence.
The pairing area was really pretty all the way through the time we published the list. Since we really hit this dry period, since we've had a lot of grazing coming in, that the floodwaters have come through and been able to cut out that rhizome and take it away. Because it was there for a long, long time.
And we're right on the edge of where it's normally found, but it's not found there now. So just to recap, we have, just like with the bone, we had like 1,200 big samples of charcoal for all these sites. And we have a report out on it now. It's available if somebody wants to look at it. That is at least the initial interpretation of how plant life changed in the canyon from AD 600 to AD 1400. And so the Phragmites indicates that river area was much more stable than it is today, and mesquite was always there, even before there were cows. And so, times are changing, and just looking back at this 1935 aerial photo, and that terrace that was there then and isn't there now, and we just got some new aerial photos from the 1950s, and haven't looked at them real hard, but I think that terrace was there in the 1950s, which means it all got washed out in the last 50 years. And so there you go, and here's our modern entrenched floodplain. Many of the old terraces and some of the plant life that used to be there are gone, and other things are happening. And so again, you take away one thing, besides the need to take a nap from this lecture, remember that archaeology provides us with the longest available record of human interaction with a dynamic environment. And it doesn't play favorites. We're not on one side or another. We're just trying to see what happened. So again, please support this museum.